This is true. The imposition of top-down socialism, or what we can call Stalinism, on Eastern Europe, partly by propaganda, but partly also because it was not a particularly satisfactory model. It tended to put people off rather than attract them. Now, certainly the revolutionary impulse in Europe persisted. We know that in Western Europe, the underlying currents there were into the 50s and into the 60s, the potential for revolution remained. In some ways it deepened. And of course, sure enough, we see that in 1968 it welled up again, in particular, well, all over Europe, but particularly in France and Italy. The revolutionary impulse re-emerged in Western Europe, and indeed we see in the case of Czechoslovakia in 1968 a similar popularly based attempt at transforming socialism. Well, what was the attitude of the official communist parties to these movements, these wellings up? Generally, extremely cautious and often very negative. That's true in France, it's true in Italy, and of course we know that it's true in Czechoslovakia with the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Moreover, the long-term effect of the heavy-handed, top-down control over popular movements and possibilities, and the fact that this was emanating from the Soviet Union and from these the Marxist-Leninist parties that were controlled by more or less controlled by the Soviet Union, tended to put many people who had revolutionary feelings and so on, or revolutionary groups, they tended to look askance at the idea of the necessity of revolutionary organization. Many of you go back to the 1960s and recall what went on here in the 1960s and the fact that you would run into all sorts of people who, especially at the beginning, who rejected the idea of any kind of revolutionary organization at all, whereas we know that, in fact, without strong organization, hopefully strong organization that is democratic, you cannot make a profound transformation of the society. But the Soviet approach, I'm arguing here this morning, and its control over the international revolutionary movement, in effect, put a damper on people's very idea that you needed strong organization in order to make political change. Now, in any case, having made that this kind of analysis, I want to talk a little bit now about the states of Eastern Europe, as they developed during the Cold War. Well, we know that, in fact, Stalin at the beginning did not wish to impose a direct Soviet system on Eastern Europe. No, he put forward an alternative. The idea was people's democracy, which between 1945 and 48 was the characteristic form of, in all of these states, under the aegis of the Red Army, people's democracies were introduced. And these people's democracies were really based on mixed economy and also a multitude of political parties. That was more or less the pattern between 1945 and 1948. It was the West, it was the United States, with, in effect, the imposition of the Marshall Plan, the division of Germany, and the installation of NATO in 1949, which amounted to, it partially was meant to revive the West European economy, but it also had the very important strategic aim of basically blockading the Soviet Union. It was, these measures were designed to, in effect, reestablish a blockade of the Soviet Union, which had been imposed originally in 1917, 1918 by the Allies back when the Soviet state was initiated. The division of Germany, the imposition of NATO, the foundation of the German Federal Republic, they were basically designed to sort of reestablish the isolation of the Soviet Union. Now, what kind of states then? By 1948, Stalin decided that the only riposte to this, in order to protect a Soviet security interest, was basically to impose the Soviet single-party state on Eastern Europe, to impose central planning, to ban alternative political movements, to institute purges, and basically to ensure Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Now, as a result, obviously, there was a great deal of political repression during this period in Eastern Europe. I would date this period of repression between 1948 and 1956. What we have here is what I would call Stalinist modernization from above. Stalinist modernization from above. Because most of these countries that I'm speaking about in Eastern Europe were still mainly feudal and economically backward countries. And the Soviet-backed regimes that were now imposed from 1948 onwards, after sweeping aside the people's democracies, imposed a sort of crash program of modernization on these different countries. I'm obviously leaving out East Germany and so on, but this is mainly true. Well, what were the elements of this kind of crash course in modernization? Well, they were land reform and collectivization, number one. Secondly, crash industrialization. The separation of the church and state, because in most of these countries, in fact, there were official churches and so on, and there was no clear distinction between the church and state in most of these countries. Mass education programs were imposed, and there was a very considerable progress for women. Opportunities opened up, important opportunities opened up for women in these Eastern European countries. Now, all of this was pursued on the basis of the Soviet pattern, the central planning and so on, the plan, and the use of what we call extensive as against intensive methods of development, as was practiced during the 5-year plans in the Soviet Union during the 1930s. Now, these regimes between 1948 and 1956 were quite repressive. They were quite repressive. However, in 1956, there was a definite change, a definite evolution in Eastern Europe. The situation changed in an important way. Because in 1956, this is 3 years after Stalin died, in the first place, what occurred in Poland, there was a revolt called the Polish Spring in October. The Polish Spring in October. And that set off the Hungarian Revolution a few weeks later. Polish Spring in October, followed by the Hungarian Revolution. And the result of that was a greater, in many of these countries, not all, but in many of them, the beginnings of a political liberalization began in 1956. There was more attention to consumer goods than in the terribly austere period between 1948 and 1956. And the Soviet Union allowed a greater degree of diversity, political diversity in Eastern Europe. What came to be described in the West as polycentrism began to develop. The complete control by Moscow diminished, and you saw in Eastern Europe kind of polycentric. Countries began to go in their own direction, and the Soviet Union led up its complete control. So, for example, in Romania, you have what is called national Stalinism. It's Stalinism, in many ways very strict, but it's combined with nationalism. They don't refer to the Soviet Union in pursuing these policies. In Hungary, you had goulash communism, great stress on supplying consumer goods to the population. In Yugoslavia, workers' control, neutralism, and an opening to the West. In Poland, you have an abandonment of the collectivization of agriculture and the persistence of a backward peasant agriculture. And indeed, important in the Polish case, a failed separation between church and state. The Catholic Church, within the whole communist state apparatus, the Catholic Church maintains a very important position. Now, during the 50s, when Khrushchev had power in the 1950s, again and again in his speeches, he said, we are overtaking the West, the communist states of the East, the Soviet Union in the vanguard. We are going to overtake the West. We're going to surpass the West economically. And there will be red plenty. There will be plenty for everyone. In fact, that's the title of a recent novel published in England. It's a very interesting novel which actually describes the mood in the Soviet Union in the 1950s. It's called Red Plenty. It just appeared 2010. It's quite good, and it explains what was going on in, I think, quite good terms. Now, of course we know that goal was not achieved. The Soviet Union was never able to catch up with the West. And we have to ask ourselves, really, in retrospect, I mean, I think some of the problems, historical problems left over are, was the economic policy of the Soviet Union and some of the East European regimes actually to achieve the same level of consumerism as existed in the West, or did they have other priorities? This is a debatable issue. We don't really know the answer to this. Likewise, what was the real nature of the bureaucracy in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union? What was its character and so on? There are great debates still raging about this, and I think one of the best studies is by a woman by the name of Catherine Samary. But we have to admit that the Soviet Union and at least Khrushchev's aspiration to catch up with the West was unsuccessful. But we should also point out that these East European states, and if you include the Soviet Union and its allies, when we look at them as a group and you compare them to any other part of the underdeveloped world, because virtually all of these countries, with the exception of Czechoslovakia, or the Czech part of Czechoslovakia, and one can argue East Germany, the rest of them were underdeveloped in the same way as the states of Asia, etc. If we look at their economic performance as compared to the rest of the underdeveloped world, we find that, in fact, they are far and away the best performers economically. Their development was remarkable during the 50s and the 1960s. Now, I would say that there are before we move away from this, I want to say that it's unclear why it all collapsed. That is to say, why at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, exactly why the whole system just folded up. Except in Romania, there was no gigantic, bloody revolution that led to the end of the system. The system just disintegrated. And why it disintegrated, I think, it remains, from the point of view of historians, a really problematic issue. It seems to me that the answer lies not at the level of economics so much as at the level of politics. There was the reasons are political, but they're not. They have not. I have read. In my eyes, they have not been fully explicated. It remains to be understood why the Soviet Union and its allies in the socialist camp basically disintegrated.